The wind in the back country of Kentucky was often as sharp and unforgiving as the tools needed to tame the wilderness. It was here, in a small one-room log cabin near Hodgensville, that Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809. His was not a lineage of aristocracy or wealth. It was a line forged in the crucible of frontier life, marked by relentless physical labor and frequent hardship. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a simple, sturdy carpenter and farmer, a man who possessed little formal education and even less patience for abstract thought. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, a woman described as intelligent and deeply spiritual, was the quiet anchor of the family, instilling in young Abraham a rudimentary sense of morality and a love for stories. Life was a continuous struggle for subsistence. In 1816, driven by land disputes and a desire to escape the slaveholding society of Kentucky, the Lincoln family moved across the Ohio River to Indiana, settling in what was then an almost impenetrable forest near Little Pigeon Creek. Abe was 7 years old. For the next decade, his days were consumed by the grueling tasks of a pioneer boy, clearing brush, splitting logs, planting crops, and hauling water. His hands, even then, were destined to become rough and calloused, a testament to the fact that he received, by his own calculation, less than a year's schooling in his entire youth. The few books available, the King James Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and A History of the United States, were not just read, they were devoured. Alone in the candlelight or stretched out on the floor with a flickering fire, young Abe would read, reread, and recite the stories and arguments he found. He would often commit long passages to memory, absorbing the rhythm and precision of the language. This self-taught literary diet was the foundational education that would later enable him to craft some of the most enduring speeches in the English language. A profound tragedy struck in 1818. The dreaded milk sickness, a poisoning caused by consuming milk from cows that had eaten the white snake root plant, swept through the settlement. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, the only woman who had truly encouraged his nascent intellectual curiosity, succumbed to the illness. Abraham was just 9 years old, and the loss was a devastating blow that left an indelible mark on his soul, fueling a deep, quiet melancholy that would follow him throughout his life. A year later, Thomas Lincoln remarried Sarah Bush Johnston, a kind and resourceful widow with 3 children of her own. Sarah proved to be a remarkable stepmother. She immediately recognized Abraham's sharp, inquisitive mind and fiercely encouraged his reading and studies, shielding him from his father's sometimes dismissive attitude toward books. Under her care, the log cabin became less a prison of labor and more a sanctuary for learning. She ensured he had paper and pen, tools that Thomas often considered frivolous. It was Sarah who truly nurtured the ambition that burned beneath the surface of the lanky, awkward boy. In 1830, when Abraham was 21, the family moved again, this time to Illinois. After helping his father establish a new homestead, Lincoln decided it was time to leave the physical demands of his father's farm and strike out on his own. He settled briefly in New Salem, Illinois, a burgeoning village along the Sangamon River. This period was a pivotal transformation. He started as a rail splitter and store clerk, but soon his keen mind and prodigious strength earned him respect. His reputation as a powerful storyteller, a natural debater, and a man of unwavering honesty, which earned him the lifelong nickname Honest Abe, began to spread. He worked as a postmaster and a surveyor, simultaneously soaking up knowledge of law, politics, and the workings of the government. He borrowed law books and taught himself the intricacies of the legal system, often reading late into the night. It was here that the young, raw pioneer began to evolve into the thoughtful, politically ambitious man who would one day lead a fractured nation. In 1834, at the age of 25, Lincoln successfully campaigned and was elected to the Illinois state legislature as a Whig,
marking the definitive end of his life as a frontier laborer and the true beginning of his political career. He had transitioned from the log cabin to the legislative hall, a journey powered not by inherited privilege, but by sheer intellect and relentless self-improvement. The path was set, but the great trials that would define his character were yet to come.
Lincoln's entrance into the Illinois state legislature in 1834 was not merely a change of profession. It was a transition into a world where his powerful, self-taught intellect could finally find its proper form. He was not a polished speaker, but his arguments were devastatingly logical, peppered with folksy anecdotes and parables that made complex issues instantly understandable to the common man. He quickly became one of the leading figures of the Whig Party in the state, known for his commitment to internal improvements, such as roads, canals, and railroads, which he believed were essential for economic prosperity. In 1837, the state capital moved from Vandalia to Springfield, a change Lincoln championed. He followed, establishing himself there as a respected lawyer. The practice of law was where he truly honed his skills. He wasn't just arguing cases. He was learning human nature, mastering rhetoric, and practicing the art of peaceful conflict resolution. He traveled across the judicial circuit, riding a horse from county seat to county seat, earning a reputation for fairness and a reluctance to take cases he believed were unjust. It was also in Springfield that Lincoln's personal life became complicated. He courted and tragically lost Anne Rutledge, a young woman from New Salem, whose death is said to have plunged him into one of his deepest bouts of melancholy. Later, in 1842, he married Mary Todd, a high-spirited, educated woman from a prominent Kentucky slaveholding family. Their marriage was tempestuous. Mary was ambitious, socially demanding, and often suffered from severe emotional instability, while Abraham was introspective, detached, and perpetually preoccupied with politics and melancholy. Yet they shared a deep bond, particularly through their shared political ambition and later their 4 sons, Robert Todd, Edward Baker, Willie Wallace, Willie, and Thomas, Tad. Only Robert survived to adulthood. The loss of 3 children in childhood or young adulthood would inflict unbearable pain on both parents, deepening Lincoln's innate sorrow. After serving 4 successful terms in the state legislature, Lincoln set his sights higher, finally achieving election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846. He moved his family to Washington, D.C., a city already simmering with the tensions that would define the next 2 decades. His single term in Congress, 1847 to 1849, was, by his own measure, largely unsuccessful. The main issue dominating the nation was the Mexican-American War, and Lincoln, opposing President James K. Polk, earned the nickname Spotty Lincoln for introducing a series of resolutions, the Spot Resolutions, demanding that Polk identify the exact spot on American soil where Mexican blood had first been shed, challenging the war's justification. His anti-war stance, though morally principled, was politically unpopular, especially back in his war-supporting district in Illinois. His term ended, and discouraged by his political misstep and the Whig Party's decline, he returned to Springfield. The next 5 years were what historians call his lost years, or wilderness period. He immersed himself fully in his law practice, becoming one of the most respected and well-paid attorneys in the West. It seemed for a time that his national political ambitions had been extinguished, replaced by a comfortable, if less fulfilling, career. But the issue of slavery, the great moral crisis of the age, would not let him rest. Lincoln personally detested slavery, calling it a monstrous injustice. He was not an abolitionist, advocating for the immediate, radical end of slavery where it already existed, but he was fiercely committed to the principle that it must not be allowed to expand into new territories.
His political reawakening came in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Championed by his longtime rival, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had limited slavery's reach, and introduced the doctrine of popular sovereignty, allowing the residents of a territory to vote on whether they would permit slavery. To Lincoln, this was not democracy. It was a catastrophic moral failure that allowed the fundamental principle of human equality to be subjected to a simple majority vote. He launched himself back into the political arena with a renewed moral fervor, galvanized by the perceived danger to the foundational ideals of the Republic. His speeches grew sharper, his purpose clearer. The issue was no longer Whig versus Democrat or North versus South. It was about whether the nation would survive, half slave and half free. This return to the political stage set the backdrop for the famous debates that would propel him from an influential local lawyer to a national figure poised for the presidency.
The political crisis sparked by the Kansas-Nebraska Act did more than just repeal a compromise. It shattered the existing party structure. The Whig Party disintegrated, and Lincoln became one of the key founding members of the new anti-slavery expansion party, the Republican Party. His singular focus was the containment of slavery, arguing that the founding fathers saw it as a temporary evil to be tolerated, not a permanent institution to be celebrated and spread. In 1858, Lincoln challenged the incumbent senator of Illinois, the powerful and nationally known Democrat Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was the architect of popular sovereignty and perhaps the most formidable orator in the country. The resulting campaign was dominated by a series of 7 joint appearances across the state, now immortalized as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. These debates were not genteel policy discussions. They were massive outdoor spectacles, drawing thousands of people who traveled miles to hear the arguments that would shape the nation's future. The core of the conflict was simple. Douglas argued that popular sovereignty upheld the democratic right of local settlers to choose their institutions, including slavery. He believed that the people of a territory should decide, and he didn't care whether they voted slavery up or down, a position he often referred to as squatter sovereignty. Lincoln, in contrast, argued that the issue was not one of mere local governance, but one of fundamental moral right and wrong. He consistently pressed Douglas to answer a key question, particularly at the debate in Freeport, Illinois. Could the people of a territory legally exclude slavery despite the Dred Scott decision, the 1857 Supreme Court ruling which stated that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories? Douglas was forced to craft a clever but ultimately damaging response, the Freeport Doctrine. He stated that while the Supreme Court might protect the right to own slaves in a territory, the territorial legislature could still practically exclude slavery by failing to pass the necessary local police regulations to protect slaveholders' property. This maneuver allowed Douglas to win the Senate seat, as Illinois voters preferred his moderate stance. However, Lincoln had achieved something far more important: national recognition. The transcripts of the debates were printed and circulated widely, allowing Lincoln's clear, principled moral argument against slavery's expansion to reach voters across the entire North. He had exposed the inherent, irreconcilable contradiction between popular sovereignty and the constitutional reality of the Dred Scott decision. Following the defeat, Lincoln continued to speak, accepting invitations to address audiences in major cities like New York. The pinnacle of this period was his Cooper Union Address in February 1860. Speaking before a sophisticated, educated East Coast audience, Lincoln delivered a masterful and meticulously researched historical argument. He proved, citing the words and votes of the 39 signers of the Constitution, that the Founding Fathers intended for the federal government to have the power to restrict slavery in the territories. His speech was a political and rhetorical triumph. It demonstrated that Lincoln was not just a clever Western lawyer, but a profound thinker, capable of articulating a sophisticated, historically grounded vision for the Republic. He concluded with a powerful moral imperative: let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. By the spring of 1860, the nation was polarized. The Democratic Party fractured over the issue of slavery, nominating two different candidates. Seeing their opportunity, the Republicans gathered in Chicago for their national convention. Though frontrunners like William Seward were initially favored, Lincoln's humble origins, his lack of any political enemies from his single congressional term, and his clear, moderate stance on slavery's expansion made him the most available and electable candidate. On the third ballot, Abraham Lincoln, the former rail splitter and self-taught lawyer, was nominated as the Republican candidate for President of the United States. His victory in the ensuing four-way election was primarily due to the fracture of the Democratic vote and his sweep of the northern states. He won with less than 40% of the popular vote, but a clear majority in the Electoral College. The election results were devastating to the southern states. They viewed Lincoln, a Republican committed to halting the expansion of their peculiar institution, as an existential threat. Before Lincoln could even be inaugurated, the first state, South Carolina, voted to secede from the Union, beginning the gravest crisis in American history. Lincoln's greatest challenge, saving the Union, was upon him before he ever set foot in the White House.
Lincoln's election in November 1860 plunged the United States into its most severe constitutional crisis. The Deep South, believing the Republican victory signaled an irreversible end to their way of life, which depended on the perpetuation and expansion of slavery, reacted immediately. South Carolina formally seceded on December 20, 1860, followed rapidly by 6 other states: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states formed the Confederate States of America, CSA, drafting their own constitution and establishing a separate government. Throughout the precarious transition period from his election to his inauguration on March 4, 1861, Lincoln remained in Springfield, watching the Union unravel. He refused to issue any public statements that might escalate the crisis, allowing his carefully chosen words from the debates and his speeches to stand. He believed that secession was illegal and unconstitutional, and that the Union was perpetual. He privately rejected any compromise that would allow slavery to expand, particularly the Crittenden Compromise, which sought to permanently enshrine slavery in the Constitution. The journey to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration was fraught with danger. Lincoln was forced to travel secretly through Baltimore due to credible threats of assassination. He arrived in the capital city, which felt more like a besieged fortress than a federal seat of government, heavily guarded. On a cold, overcast March day, Lincoln delivered his first inaugural address. Standing on the east portico of the Capitol, he spoke directly to the seceded states, mixing firmness with genuine plea. He declared his intention to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, which included federal forts in the South. Crucially, He reassured the South that he had no lawful right or inclination to interfere with the institution of slavery where it already existed. But he also issued a powerful appeal to the bonds of history and affection. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. His words unfortunately fell on deaf ears in the Confederacy. The question of when, where, and how the war would begin hinged on the status of a few remaining federal outposts in the South. The most famous was Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort was running critically low on supplies. Lincoln faced an impossible choice: resupply the fort, which would certainly provoke the Confederacy into an attack, or abandon the fort, which would legitimize the secession and cripple the Union's authority. Lincoln chose a middle path. He notified the governor of South Carolina that he would send only food and non-military supplies. This put the moral and political burden of starting the war squarely on the Confederates. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries surrounding Fort Sumter opened fire. The Civil War had begun. Following the attack and the surrender of Fort Sumter, Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteer troops to suppress the rebellion. This act was seen by the Upper South, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, as a declaration of war against the South as a whole, and these states promptly seceded, completing the 11-state Confederacy. Suddenly, the lawyer and former legislator was forced to transform into a commander-in-chief. He had no military training, but his political acumen and clarity of purpose were immediately evident. He recognized that the primary overriding goal was the preservation of the Union, and he would utilize every means necessary, including constitutional suspensions, massive mobilization of resources, and the eventual necessary step toward emancipation to achieve it. Lincoln's story had transitioned completely. The boy who read by firelight and the lawyer who debated in courts was now the leader of a nation on the brink of self-destruction. The long, bloody chapters of the Civil War, the strategic decisions, the struggles with generals, and the profound moral weight of emancipation were now his burden. The trial of his presidency had begun, carrying the fate of American democracy on his shoulders.